everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Marios, and today we will be talking about Gin. Gin is a web framework written in Go, which particularly focuses on how we write API services. It is written on top of httprouter, which is a well-known router among the Go community, meaning that Gin inherits all the benefits around performance that come from it. The main reason is that Gin provides simple abstractions on top of httprouter without being convoluted with unnecessary functionality that in reality will make it significantly slower. It is very easy to understand and it can boost your productivity in a small period of time. It is common to write a web service in a couple of weeks, which usually isn't the case if you are using a different language and tooling. But just to prove that Gin is attractive among other developers as well, I visited the official repository of Gin, and as you can see on the top right corner, currently Gin has 51.5k of stars. For those reasons, I decided to create a crash course around Gin, since I believe it's a strong asset and a necessary skill for a full stack developer. Building a web service is the norm nowadays, so it's good to surround yourself with the right tools, and I believe Gin is one of them. Before we start, I want to give a brief idea of what we will be covering. We will start creating our setup and then move into building a simple Hello World controller. The main goal of this exercise is to familiarize ourselves with some of the starting pieces of Gin framework. Then we will check the core features of Gin, which include adding routes and organize them using HTTP verbs and grouping, extract information coming from the request payload, model binding, validation and custom validators, static file rendering, HTML files rendering, redirects, middlewares, and testing. Then, to wrap up everything of what we have learned, we will develop a CRUD API for a products resource. Using the API, we will be able to fetch products, get an individual product, create, update, and delete a product. Without further ado, let's start with our first task. We will be starting by creating our setup, so I will create a Go module with the name Crash Course Gin Gonic. Then I will install the Gin framework. I will create the main file, and within it I will set the main function, import the Gin module, create a Gin router, create a variable for the address. So the router will be running on 3000. I need to set a handler, so I will set a hello handler, and I will create a controller. Within the controller, I will return a string of a hello world and an HTTP code of 200. I need to import the net HTTP module, and then I will run the server using the 3000 port. I will log any error if it comes from the router. If I run it and try to call the endpoint, and I'm calling the hello endpoint, I get a hello world response and a 200 status code. Let's try to understand the code now. So we check the default method. It returns an engine with the logger and recovery middleware assigned to it. So we call the new method, returns an engine, and we assign the logger and recovery middleware to it. Then we check the get handler. We see that it uses a relative path and the handler are assigned to it. So internally it uses the handle method. Lastly, if we see the run method, it assigns the router to an HTTP server, which starts to listening and serving HTTP requests. Before we finish this section, I'm going to install Reflex, which allows us to keep track of the changes that are happening within our files and restart the server. I will also create a make file, and within it I will register the dev command, and I will use Reflex to keep track of the Go files. Previously we used get to register a handler to our router, and if we see internally, get is a shortcut for router to handler, so it accepts our parameter and pass them down into the handle method. So if we replace get with handle and pass as the first argument the http verb, which in that case it will be get, our server is still working okay. Handle is a generic method which can be used for any type of http verb. So to demonstrate it, I will create a post endpoint which will live under the /post, and as a response it will return a 200 status code and the message of post. If we test it, we get a valid response. And if we try to use the post method available from Gene and remove the http verb, the server is still working, and if we call the endpoint, we still get a valid response. So Gene provides shortcuts for all http verbs so that to be more easily organized and more readable when we develop our service. In general, Gene provides shortcuts for get, post, put, delete, head, and options verbs. Another handy feature that Gene provides us is the group method. If we check the documentation, group creates a new router group, which is a way to organize our handlers with a better way. In our case, I will create a group and I will call it V1, just to demonstrate in the case of if we want to version our API. I will update the existing handler to live under the V1 group, and I will also create another handler which will be registered in the router. It will be under the /get endpoint, and it will return status code of 200 and a get response. If I call both of the endpoints, I see that they get a 200 response for /get, and if I call the hello controller, I get a 200 response. But if I try to call /hello, I get a 404, and this is because it is registered under V1. If I try to create another group with the name V2 and register the get handler into V2, if I try to call the endpoint on /API /V2 /get, I get a 200 response. But if I call /get, I get a 404. Let's move into our next section now, which is accessing information from a request. There are various ways on how we can pass information from the client to the server, but the most important one is using URL parameters, headers, query strings, and URL encoded data. So the methods that I want us to cover are c.param context.query context.default query. We will discuss the difference in a bit. Post form, default post form, and get header. Before we start, I will clean my file and remove the groups that we have created before. And I will update my controller so that it lives under the router. So let's start with the param method. So if we check the Gene documentation, param returns the value of the URL parameter, and Gene also gives us an example of how we can use it. So in our case, I would try to access an ID coming from our request. So we need to update our relative path so that includes an ID. So I would use an example of a product. So in the product's endpoint, we will be passing an ID, and that ID will be accessed inside the controller. Pay attention that we use colon to label our keys, and I will also print the value of the ID. If I call the endpoint and pass an ID to it, I see that I get the ID logged over there and the request is successful. So let's move into c.query. So if we check the documentation, it says that query returns the keyed URL query value if it exists, otherwise it returns an empty string. So that's the limitation of the query string, which is resolved by the default query, since we can pass a fallback value, and Gene will use that fallback value if it doesn't find the key. So to demonstrate it, I will use query, and in my request I will pass an ID to it, and as you see, we got the value of 1, but if I don't pass anything, I get an empty string. So to resolve that, I will use the default query, and I also need to pass a fallback value. I will use the value of 100. So if I pass an ID now, I still get the value of 1, but if I remove it, I get the fallback value, which is 100. And those are the two main methods that they are used for accessing query parameters. The next method that I want to cover is post form. So if we check the Go documentation, it says that post form returns a specified key from a post URL encoded form or multipart. So we need to make sure that our request is a post and the data they are coming as URL encoded. So in our example, I will use post form and expect an ID coming as a URL encoded data. So in that case, I will update my request to be a post request, and the body will be form URL encoded data. So in the data, I will pass the value of 1, but before I call the endpoint, I need to update my controller. So I will use post over there, and if I call it now, I get the value of 1. And that's okay, but if I remove it and don't pass anything, I get an empty string. So we can use the default post form to resolve the issue, and similarly as default query, we can pass a fallback value. So in that case, I will pass 100, and if I pass an ID again, I get the value of 1, but if I remove it, I get the fallback value, which is 100. Lastly, we can use the getHeader method to access data coming from our request. And if we check the Gene documentation, we see that get header returns value from request headers. And if we try to check the method, so if we check the Gene implementation, the get header use the request header method available from the Gene context. And if we check deeper, we see that it accesses the request header, and from the headers it uses a getter, so the get and pass the key within it. So make sure that the information that the header that you want to access is available in the request. And if you want to access information in the response headers, then you need to use a different way. So to continue with our example, I will update our headers and pass an ID. So I will make sure to be in lowercase, and if I pass the ID, I get the value of 1, and if I remove it, I get an empty string. The next thing we will be covering is model binding, and if you are not familiar with the idea, we do model binding whenever we want to map a specific information into our structs. So in the case of Go, we want to map that information into our Go struct. So Gene provides multiple methods which we can use to map information coming from the request payload into a Go struct. So one of them is should bind URI. So it binds data coming from URL values. We can also use should bind JSON. So it will bind JSON data coming in the request payload. We haven't seen any method which we can use to access JSON data, so that's the first time that we encounter how we map information for JSON data. We can also use should bind, so that refers for URL encoded data. And the last one is should bind header, which allow us to bind headers that they are coming in the request. To start with, I will check the should bind URI. So if we check the Gene documentation, it says that should bind URI binds the pass struct pointer using the specified binding. So in our case, I will create a Go struct and I will call it URI binding. And within it, I will set an ID. That ID will be a string, and I will set a tag. So to let know Gene where it needs to look, I need to set a tag with the value of URI. So it specifically tells to Gene, okay, look into the URL parameters and look for the ID key and do the mapping for me. So in that case, I will create a binding, and I will use, so if I call should bind URI, so we see in the signature that it returns an error, so I will set that one into a variable, and I will also pass as an argument the pointer of the binding. So I will check if the value of the error is not near, then I want to return a status code of 400 and pass the string the value of the error. I also want to print what's available, the data actually, and if I print the value of them, we can call our endpoint. So get a request, and if I call it, we got the 404, and that's because we're still using a post HTTP verb, so I need to use a get. So if we check our console now, we get the value of 1. So Gene also provides the bind. So you see that all the methods that I described, they start with should. So Gene also provides another syntax, which is bind URI in that case. So the difference is that by default Gene sets a 400 status code. However, I don't recommend it because most of the times we want to control the status code that we return. So it's better for us to use the should bind syntax since we are able to pass the right status code that we believe. And now let's move into the should bind JSON. So if we check the documentation, we see that should bind JSON is a shortcut for should bind with, and we pass an object and the binding of a JSON. So in our case, I will create a product struct. The struct will have an ID, and I will set a tag to it, and I will also need to set a name. So in that case, I will set name, and in my controller, I set a variable of the product and update my code to include the should bind JSON, and I will pass a pointer of the product, and I also need to log the value of the product. So if I log the value, and so what we need to do is to update our request to be a post. So we want to post data, and to make more sense, we don't usually post under /products/ID. So we usually, whenever we want to create a resource, which is the case that we post data, post JSON data, we do it under the name of the resource only, so that it and so in REST convention, that means that we want to create a product in our resource. So if we update our request and pass JSON data, update our URL to be a product, and within it I pass an ID, so that ID will have the value of 1, and the name, which is Apple, let's say. So if I post the data, I see that I get the ghost track over there. One thing that we need to pay attention is that we need to make sure that we use uppercase, because if we use lowercase, Gene won't do the mapping for us, since the field is not exported from the ghost track. So now the value of the struct is empty, and by default, if we're not passing a tag to it, it assumes that we use camel case in our syntax. So in that case, now that we are not passing anything, it still does the mapping. But if there is a scenario, for example, that you have, let's say, created at, which is the date that the product has been created, right? And this is a string, and we don't set a tag to it. And if we pass it in our request, right? And if it's a lowercase, so, and let's say, and if we pass it, we see that we are missing that value. But if we pass created at, we see that we get the value. So if you do want to do mapping, for example, from snake case into camel case, it's preferred to set the JSON tag and set specifically on what you want to do. So in that case, if I set created at and call it, I see that I get the data that the product has been created. Cool. Now let's see the should bind method. And the should bind method is used whenever we want to access URL encoded data coming from our request. And to demonstrate it, I will reuse the same product struct. I will remove the created tag field, the created at field, and in the ID I will use the form tag and pass the key to it. So this tells to Gene, okay, looks for URL encoded data and search for the ID, and the same applies for the name tag. So if I update my controller correctly and if I update my request now to use URL encoded data and pass an ID and a name as well. So I will use the same for example. Let's see that we get the same, and we get our product logged in our console. And what we discussed about JSON data, it also applies for URL encoded. So if we set the fields of our struct into lowercase and try to call the endpoint, we see that the struct is empty. So Gene hasn't populated any values. And one thing that we need to make sure is that to always include the form tag, because if we don't include it, Gene won't know on which key should look in the URL encoded data, so it just will return empty. So we always need to include it. This wasn't the case for JSON data, since it was assuming that we were gonna pass JSON data and was using camel case, but for URL encoded data, you need to make sure that you pass the right tag to it. Lastly, let's see the sheet bind header method. So this method, if we check the Gene documentation, we see that it's a shortcut for C sheet bind with, and it just passes a binding of header. So it is essentially used for mapping data coming from the request headers. So in our case, I want to map the request ID. So I will set request ID, that would be a string, and I need to set the header tag, and I will call it X request ID. So this would be the name that would be included in the headers. And if I set a variable of it and use the right method, pass a pointer, and if I look the data, actually let's go to binding. So now if I post in the headers and try to set X request ID, set the value of 1, I need to make sure that I use the right syntax. Right. So I'm just gonna paste this one, to be honest. So I call it and I see that the map has been done correctly. In the previous two sections, we covered how we can access information from the request payload using simple methods available from the Gene context, but we also showed how we can use model binding to map information from the request into a particular Go struct. Model binding is a recommended approach in terms of how we access information, not only because we can use it to easily map information to a Go struct, but we can also use it to apply some validation rules into our model. I am in the official documentation of Gene, and as you can see here, Gene uses Go Playground Validator v10, and the syntax on how we can assign rules into our Go struct is by adding the binding tag, and within double quotes we include the rule that we want to apply. In this example, we are using the required rule, so the field of user needs to definitely appear into our mapping, which is happening into the sheet bind JSON. But if you're wondering which other methods they are available, we can check the validator documentation, and if you scroll down, you will see that there are many available options, and most of the times those options should be sufficient on most of the tasks that you are doing. So for example, the required if, we can use it to make an equality check between the field and the value that we are passing of a particular field and the value that we want to check. We can also use the required with rule, which creates independency between two fields. For example, let's say that we have a field 1 that will be passed into our payload, and we want to field 2 to also appear if we are passing the field 1. So we can use the required with rule that creates a dependency between those two fields. So let's show a few examples on how we can use them. So in our case, I will try to create a custom struct, and I will use that struct to post information, and we're gonna validate that information from the payload. So a customer needs to have an email, so I will pass email there, and in the validation we want to make that field required and also check to be an email. We can also use a customer also needs to have a role, so and that field will also be required, and I want to make sure that it's either an admin or a basic role. So in that case, I will use the one-off validation rule and pass the options of basic and admin. And a customer can also have an address, so I will call it street address. And we won't apply any validations, and we can also have a street number, so that one will be an integer, and we want to send a string the street number only when the street address is available. So in that case, I will use the require with option, which will make it required only if the street address is available. So if I update my controller now, so I will update the products to be customers. So whenever we post data into that endpoint, we want to create a customer, let's say. So I will set a variable of my customer model, pass it into the sheet bind JSON method, and I will log the customer. If we check the endpoint, I'm gonna select the post option and also pass JSON. So if I pass an empty object, I get two errors. So one of them is for the email, so it tells me that the email it's a required field, and the same applies for the row field. So if I now pass an email, but the format of that email, let's say that it's wrong, so we still get an error about email, but in that case it tells us that's the issue, it's on the email tag. So it seems that the email rule that we have set is working okay. And if I pass a valid email, then we see that the error has gone away. If I pass a row, so let's say that I want to pass a random row, just to see like if my one-off rule is working okay, we see that we get the error, and the error is coming from the one-off tag. So in that case, I will use basic, and pass, I get a 200 response. So let's see now what we can do with the street address. So let's say that we are passing an address, and now what we expect is to Gene catch an error about the missing street number. So if I call it, we see that we get the error because of the required width field. So now if I try to pass it, and let's pass an integer, so we see that we get a 200 response. And there are many validation rules available, but Gene also allows us to create our custom rule. So in that case, let's say that a customer wants to have, we want the customer to have a password. So in that case, I will need to set the name of it, and what we can do, we can create a custom validator. So I will set that one to required and set an option of password. So we will be creating that option into our validator instance. But before this one, let's see into the documentation how we can do it. And if we scroll down and see like into custom validators, what we can do is to access the validator engine, which is created when we run our server, and we can register a validation rule. So that rule will be a function, and that function, the signature of this function will be like what we see over here. So we have access into the field, and we need to return a Boolean flag, and the validation will be happening within it. So let's try to create something similar for the password field. So I will first create my function. So that one will be verify password. And the field needs to be a validator field level, and we need to return a Boolean flag, and in that case I will return false. Okay, and what I want to do now is to get access into the validator engine. So in that case, we'll be doing this, and if we check the implementation of the engine, we see that it returns to us an interface. So we need to cast that interface. So I will call it v, and since I will be casting it, I will also check if the casting was successful, and be doing this, and if that's successful, then I want to register my validation rule. So I would call it password, and I will set the function as the second parameter. So if I try to call my endpoint now, so remember that the password it's a required field. So in that case, I get the error because of the required field. So if I try to pass something now, let's say password and pass 1, 2, 3. So we get an error because of the password tag. So it seems that we have successfully registered our function. So what we can do is to create a regex. And what we want to do now is to add the regex. So the password needs to be larger than 8 characters, and we want to match the field. But before this one, let's see what is available from the field level. So that's an interface, and we want to access the field, which is a reflection value. So if we check the documentation, we see that the string method is available, which gonna return to us a string. So I will comment for the moment this one, and let's say value, and we want to return a string, so I will call this one password. So we validate our password against our regex, and we're gonna return the value of it. So if we check the match string, it already returns a boolean flag, so we can return that value. Cool. So let's try to test it out. And if we check it, we still get an error, and that's because we only pass like 4 numbers. But if we include more of them, 5, 6, 7, 8, we see that we get a 200 response. There are 3 main methods available from Gin, which we can use to load asset files, and those 3 methods are staticfs, which is very similar with static, with the only difference that we need to pass an http directory to it, and static file. The difference between the other 2 is that the static file focuses only for a particular file, so you use it only to load a single file. And if we check the Gin documentation, we see that the signature of static is it accepts 2 parameters, the relative path and root, which both of them they are strings. And if we see the example here, the first argument sets the location within our server, and the second parameter is to set the location of the asset within our file system. If we move into the staticfs, we see that the signature is a bit different, and the second parameter is an HTTP file system, so you need to use the HTTP module so that you set the location of the directory. And the last option, which is static file registers a single route in order to serve a single file of the local file system, and here is an example. So in that case, we said that we want to serve the favicon under that location, and the location in the file system is this one. So let's start with the static option, and we want to load some assets. So we're gonna load them under the /assets in our server, and we need to set the location of our assets. So let's say that we're gonna create a directory which is assets. So since the directory is not available, I need to create it, and I will create a file which is hello. And if I bring my browser, and try to call the environment, so I will call assets, and I will call for hello, and that should be txt. So we see that we get the file that we render from our assets. So if I remove the file and just leave assets, we see that we are not getting anything at the moment, but by default Gin will look for an index file. So if we create an index.html and try to load some content within it, by default Gin will look for that for index.html. So if we reload the page, and we got the HTML file. So we can also use staticfs to register a single directory, and what we need to do now is to use an HTTP directory, which is, I'm gonna set the same relative path, and if I repeat the same steps, I see that I get my HTML file, and if I try for the hello file, I still get my hello file. So let's try to save a single static file now, and I want that file to be available under hello. I need to set the location of the asset. So that file will be this one. So I'm expecting by calling that endpoint to get the hello.txt. So just to see that we don't render anything now on the assets hello.txt, we see that we get the 404, but if I go into hello, we see that we get the assets that we are serving. Nowadays, the use of server-side application is not so frequent. However, if you came across server-side applications, they usually include a directory locally with templates within it, and the server, when accepts requests, it searches the directory and loads its HTML template. The server is also responsible to dynamically populate those templates and return them to the client so that they are rendered into the browser. Gin provides similar functionality using the load.html glob and load.html files, which are focused to set the location of the templates directory. In our case, I will set the name of the methods which we can use, just for reference. And I will check the Gin documentation and search for HTML glob. So as you can see, it accepts a single parameter, which is a pattern, and that pattern is a glob pattern. So it means that we can pass wildcard characters. And if we check for load HTML files, it accepts a variadic parameter, so we can pass like as many files as we want. And this is specifically used to load particular files. As you may understand, the load HTML glob it's the preferred approach since it provides more flexibility. And I personally use this one very frequently compared to how many times I'm using the load HTML files. So to demonstrate this one, I will clean my file first, because we have a lot of code from our previous sections. And now I will set the location of the templates, but before doing it, we need to create a templates directory. And within that directory, I will create a home HTML template. And I will set a title with the name home. And I will also create an about page. And the about page which also has a title with the name about. Now I will use the load HTML glob. So I will set the location of the templates and use the asterisk to specify all the files within the templates directory. Now I need to create a controller. So if a request comes into home, then I want to load the home template. So the method that I can use from context is HTML. So let's have a look to it. And as you see, it accepts 3 parameters. The first one is the status code that we want to return. The second one is the name of the file that we want Gin to search for. And the last option is an object, an interface. And that object is passed down into the templates, and we are using it to dynamically populate the templates. So as a start, I will return a status code of 200. Set the name of the file. So for the home endpoint, I want to return the home template, and I won't be passing any data for the moment. And the other controller will be for the about. And if I bring my browser now, and try to access the home page, I see that I get my home template, and if I try to load the about page, you see that I got the about template. So that's really nice, but what if we want to pass some extra information down to our template? So let's say that in the home page, I want to set the title dynamically. So what I can do is to use a syntax available from Go, which we can access the data from the object over here. So in that case, I would try to access the title and set it over here, and that syntax needs to use 2 curly braces, and we assume that we have access into the object, and then we try to access the key within that object. And let's say that we want to pass something else, and that one would be a div, and that one would be description. Okay, and if I try to pass an object in Gin, so the first one will be home, and the other one will be description. So if I try to load my home page now, we see that we get the template with the values that we have passed into our controller. And now let's show how we can use the HTML files. So the idea on how we set up controller is the same. And as we said, the difference between HTML files and HTML glob is that for HTML files, you need to set the replication of all your files, and you can't use wildcard characters. And in that case, I would only be using home. So if I try to access home, I still get a 200 response and my page, but if I try about, I get a 500 error, and we see in the server it failed, and the reason is because we are not including it into the HTML files. So if we include it now, and we see that the server is running now, and load the page, we get the about page. Redirect is a common way to navigate users into a target location, and a common scenario is when you have a legacy endpoint and you have created a new, and as a business you want users to be navigated into the new endpoint, and you create a redirect between the old endpoint and the new endpoint. Gin provides functionality which we can use and redirect users into specific locations. That method is available under the Gin context, and if we check the Gin documentation, we see that the redirect, it accepts 2 parameters. The first parameter is the status code, and the second one is the location. The status code, it should be a temporal or a permanent redirect, and the location is the URL that you want to redirect your users. To demonstrate it, I will redirect users coming from home page into the about page, and what I will be doing is to use the redirect option, and I want to make a 307 redirect, and I want to redirect users into the about page. So if I bring my browser, and if I access home page, I see that I have been redirected into the about page. Middlewares is a common way to execute code before the request reach into our controller, and Gin provides functionality on how we can do this one. In Gin, we have the use method, which if we check into the documentation, it accepts a variadic parameter of 100 functions, which are middlewares, and those middlewares will be executed when requests reach to our controllers. we have already been using middlewares into our application, since the default method by default attaches the logger and recover middleware. And to test it, we can replace the default with new. And what we expect now is that whenever we call any of our endpoints, we expect to get any log data into the console. So if I try to call the about page, we see that we get the response, but we didn't get anything over here. But if I replace it with default, we log the request that came into our application. So let's try to create our first middleware now. So I will clean some of the code that we have, and what I will be doing is to create an endpoint first. So that endpoint will be used just to make a request to it. And before the router, I want to create a middleware. So in that case, I will use the use method, and the signature of the middleware is the same as the controller, so it accepts a pointer of a Gin context. And in that case, I'm just gonna log something. And if we call it, we see that we log the information that we want, and we got the 200 response. A common scenario for a middleware is when you want to assign an ID into your request. So you want to track any requests that they are coming into your application, and the common way is to assign an ID to them. So the way to do it is by inspecting the headers and checking if the XRequest ID header is not available. Then I would generate an ID and assign it to the request. So I will be using this library to generate unique IDs, and in our example here, I will be extracting the request ID. And if there is a request ID, if there isn't any request ID, then do this code. Otherwise, you need to assign the existing request ID into the request response. So in that case, I will be using the writer object, and in the headers of the writer, I want to assign the request ID. And the ID will be the same like what has been passed in the request to me. So in the case of not having a request ID, I would generate one. And I will do exactly the same like what I have done here, with the only difference that I need to pass the ID that I generated. So I just want to see that I need to remove this one. And if we try to call our endpoint now, so if I don't pass anything, I get a 200 response, and in the response I get the request ID that automatically generated. So if I keep calling the endpoint, we see that the request ID changed. Now if I try to pass a request ID, and I will copy this value, so we expect the value to not be updated, and as you see, I keep calling the endpoint and the value remains the same. So that's a common scenario to use a middleware. And another example is when you do some authentication, and Gin provides us the basic auth method. And if we check the documentation, we see that it returns HTTP authorization middleware, and the argument is a map of string. So what we need to do now is to create an accounts variable, which is a map of strings. And I need to send accounts to it. So the key is the username and the value is the password. So in that case, I will be using John and full bar, and I will remove the middleware we have for the request ID, and I will be using the basic auth and pass the accounts to it. So if I call the endpoint now, we see that we get a 401 response, so we are unauthorized. And what we need to do so that we get through the middleware, we need to pass the username and the password of the account that we have over there. So we can use buffer, and we see that we got a 200 response with the pong response. And if I mistype something, so I get a 401. As you may see here, the middleware is executed for all the controllers that we have in our application. So in that case, if I have a hello, and try to call the hello endpoint, we still get a 401 response. But some case we don't want to add authentication in some of our endpoints, and what we can do is to pass the middleware as a parameter before the controller. So in that case, I will create an auth middleware variable, and I will pass this one into the ping controller, and I'm not passing anything into the hello endpoint. And if I call hello, I get a 200 response. But if I try to access the ping endpoint, I get a 401 response, and I need to pass something valid so that I get a 200 response. The last thing that I want to cover before we move into developing our CRUD products API is to see how we can return responses. And until now, we have been using the string method, which is used to assign a status code and return a string. By default, when we are using the string method, we set the content type of the response to be text plain, but often we want to return JSON data, and to do it, we need to update our method to be JSON. And if we check the documentation, we see that it serializes a given struct and it returns a response to the application. And by default, we set the content type to be application JSON. So if we create a Go struct, and I will be using the custom struct, and try to create a variable here, and try to set some default values to it, and what other options we have, and I will set password as well. Now I will return an address and a street number, so I will set 1, and I want to return this one into the response. So if I try to call my endpoint now, so make a get request into customers, and it's not customers, it's ping, so I need to set this one into ping. So I call the endpoint, I'm not authorized because I haven't removed the auth middleware, and let me remove those. So if I call the endpoint now, we see that we get the response, and in the headers, the content type, it's application JSON. But if we try to do something, if we try to do the same with setting the string method, we get an error because we can't pass a construct, and the main reason is because with the data needs to be plain text. The last option, which we have already shown, is the HTML, and we use it only when we want to render HTML templates. But before we use it, we need to make sure that we are using the load HTML glob or the load HTML files methods, which specify the location of the templates directory. Now is the time to test ourselves, and to apply what we have learned, we'll be creating a simple create products API where users can communicate with it and create products, fetch a list of product, fetch a particular product, delete the product, and update the product. So there will be 5 endpoints that we will need to create, and to understand them, let's write them down. So we will be creating a get endpoint, and that one will be on /products, and we will be using this one to get a list of products. The second endpoint will be products /GUID, so we will be passing a GUID to that endpoint, and we'll be searching our database for a particular product. The third endpoint is we will be making a post to the 2 products, and we will be passing a payload, and using that payload we'll be registering a product in our database. The fourth endpoint will be products:/GUID. So whenever we contact that endpoint, we will be passing a payload, and that payload will be used to update a particular product. And the last endpoint will be, we will be using a delete HTTP method, and the endpoint will be under the products/GUID. So whenever we use this endpoint, we'll be deleting a product from our data store. The success of each endpoint, get products, will be returning a 200 status code. Whenever we find a particular product, we'll be returning a 200 code. Whenever there is a successful post of the product, we'll be returning a 201 code. So that HTTP code refers to when a new resource is created. Whenever we update something, we'll be returning a 200 status code, and we'll be returning the updated product. And whenever we delete something from the database, we will be returning a 204 status code, so no content will be returned in that case. For this exercise, I will be using my Thunder client here. So before I start doing anything, I want to configure it. So I will be creating a collection which I will call products exercise, and within that collection I will be creating a few endpoints. So one of them will be the products endpoint, so I will be using localhost and 300 port in that case. So whenever someone calls that endpoint, we will need to get and we will get a list of our products. So if I go here and save it to my collection, so I want to set a name to it, so get products, and I would save it into my products collection. And if we see our collection, so it has that endpoint now. So now let's move into the get a single product. So whenever someone calls an endpoint, we will be getting a particular product. So if I save that one in my collection, I would save it as get product and set it into my products collection. So we see that it has been created here. The next one will be to post a product, and in that case I want to also set a JSON. For the moment I will set an empty object. So whenever we call this one, so that one post product. The next endpoint we'll be creating is products, and we will passing a GUI to it as well. So this one will also be a JSON, and we will be passing an empty payload for the moment. I will be saving this in my collection, so I will save it with the name put product. And the last endpoint we will be creating is the delete product. And for this one, we don't need to pass any payload. And I can save it now in my collection. So it has been created. Let's review what we have in our collection. So we have get products, get product, post product, put product, and it seems that I saved this one incorrectly. So if I rename it, I will call it delete product, and voila, it's there. So that's good until now. So I will be creating the templates directory that we created in the previous section, as well as the assets directory. And we still need the make file to run our server, and we can slowly starting to organize our files. So I will be deleting the types that we created there, and the functionality we have written over here, and our router is running, and we can now create our controllers. So I will create my controllers into a Go module. So in that case, I will create the internal modules, and within it I will create another module which will be controllers, and here I will create my controllers. I want them to organize them as much as I can. So in that controller I will be getting the products, and I will setting package controller. So the name of it, we want to export it, so we use uppercase get products, and the parameter will be a pointer of context, and in that case I will be, for a start, I will be returning a 200 status code, and that one will be get products. Right, so here it is. And let me fix the name actually, because that gets products. So the next one will be get product. And I set it here. I'm going to create one controller for posting a product. And this one will be post product. I want one controller for deleting a product. And the last controller is put product. And we created our controllers. Now we need to register them in our router. So as you see, I created that module. So what I need to do now is to import that module and point the controller's controller location, so I can access them using the controllers, since the name of the package is controller. So what I can do, I can register the routes now. So I would set products. So I get http verb for the path of /products, and we need to set our get products controller. Now we need to set them for a single product, and that one will be get product. And here I will be setting the post, here will be the delete, and that will be the hood. So for the post I need to remove this one, post product, delete product, and put product. So we can test what we have written now, and what we can do is to go into our collection and see what we get. So when we get the product, we get the products. When we want to get a single product, we get the get product. When we want to post a product, post products. When we want to update the product, put product, and whenever we want to delete the product, we delete the product. Cool. So everything is working okay now, and the next step is to import our database, and we will be using SQLite since it's very easy to configure and set up for small scale projects. So in that case, I need to install the SQLite drive and the SQLite driver. So I will be using this and now it's time to create our database, and we will be using SQLite in that case since it's very easy to configure and it works really well for small scale projects. So in that case, I will be using the SQLite driver, and I need to install it into my modules. We will also need to install a library to generate unique IDs. So I will be using the UUID library. Let's try to have a look and familiarize ourselves with SQLite. So we will be creating the data.db, and as you can see here, we don't have any tables, neither schemas. If you are not familiar with SQLite, you can use .help, and it will give you a list of options available which you can use. A few other commands available from SQLite are dbconfig, so if you're interested to find the configuration of the database. Tables, as we discussed, schema to find your schema. You can find the stats of the database. And what else? And yeah, we can save and set the name of the database that we want to set over there, and we can also use quit, which will exit from the database. So let's try to log into the database again, and what we need to do now is to create a schema for our products. So I will be creating a SQL file here, and I will put some SQL to create our products table. So this will include an ID, and we expect the ID to be an integer, to work as a primary key and be auto incremented. The next thing we want is each product will have a name, and that one will be voucher, and I will set 255 characters. So this one needs to be unique and not null, so we need to pass it when we create the product. And next is price, so price should be a real number, and that one needs to not be null as well. We can't pass a description for the product, and that one needs to be a text, but we are not forcing anyone to pass a description. And we also need to set a create date for the product, and that one will be a text and not null, so we need to register it. And what we miss here is the GUID. So we will be, rather than accessing the database using IDs, we will be using GUIDs, because in general it's good practice to hide the ID of your product, and you don't want to expose it into your clients, and it's better to work with GUID. So in that case, I will be using the GUID, and that one I will set it to be a voucher, 55 characters. Needs to be unique and not now. Cool. So let's try to create our schema now. And if I paste it here, and see, we have a tables of products, and we can, if we check the schema, now we get the table that we have created. We can try to insert something. Let's say insert products, insert table products, and we'll be passing, we don't need to pass an ID, so we'll be passing GUID, name, price, description, and created art, and we'll be passing values. And in that case, we need to find a GUID, so let's just pass something custom now. Apple, so the price of the apple will be 0.9, and we won't be, so let's pass a description, but it's not necessary, and we need to pass a date as well. So and now if we try to find what we have into the table, we see that we created an entry with our product, but we don't need it anymore, so we can delete it. And now if we check, we see that or exit, and we are good. Nice. So we created our controllers, and we can start slowly working in. Before we create the database connection, let's have a look on what is provided from the database SQL module. So if I go on database SQL, we see that we get a few options. So there is a DB struct here, and there is also a con struct. So essentially we want to create a connection, and we need to get a DB struct, and to do this one we'll be using the open method. So let's start with open, and we want to set the name of the driver, and in that case it's SQLite, and I need to set the location of the database. And if we check the signature of open, it returns a pointer of a DB and an error. So I will be setting my database here, and I'll set error there, and I'll be assign it. And if the error is not null, then I want to terminate. I want to terminate my server, and that should be okay. Before this one, I want to make a default to close the DB just to save resources. And what we need to do now is to make a simple ping. So we'll be pinging the database just to make sure that the connection is valid, and we see that the return value from ping method, it's an error, and we can evaluate that error. So if we get an error, we want to terminate our connection, and this should be enough. So we see that the server is running okay, so the connection is valid, and we can continue passing the database into our controllers so that they have access to it. One way for passing the database into the controller is to create a closure. So let's set our get products controller, which would be a closure. So the first argument would be the DB. So, and the second argument would be, and the return value from the get products would be a gene handler. So and here we'll be putting our controller, and there we need to set it over here, and we see that we don't get any errors. And if we try to call the get products, or first we need to pass the DB into the get products, and if we call our endpoint for get products, we see that we still get a 200 response. So we'll be doing the same on the rest of the controllers. So we need to return a gene.handler, and here it is. Next, we need to move into the delete products. There are 2 more controllers that we need to update. I'll be copying it, to be honest. Cool. So if we test our controllers now, so get products, we haven't passed them down into the main function, so here we need to pass them into, and it seems that we are missing something. Yep, so this needs to be a DB, and let me just copy it because I created the same mistake for all of them. Cool. So if I made 60, so we still have it over here. So if we go into main, we see that we don't get any error and the server is running okay, so we can test our endpoints now. So get products, get all the products, get a single product, post product, put the product, and delete the product. Nice. So all the controllers, they are working okay. So let's start now by posting product. So we will be passing a payload when in our post, and that payload will include the name, a description, and the price of the product. And we're dynamically gonna create the GUID and create the add date. So we will be creating a struct in that case. So that struct will be post product, and as we said, we need to have a name. So, and we will be using model binding, and we want that one to be a required field. The next field, it will be price, and we want it to be a float. So that one is also a required field and needs to be greater than of 0. So we don't want to accept a negative price. And the other option is description, and this one will be string. So, and this one is optional, so we can ignore it since we don't want to make it valid, or we want to set a limit into the description. So in that case, if you're not passing anything, then ignore it. But if someone passes some description, then we need to set a limit, and in that case I will set it to 250 characters. Cool. And what we need to do now is to set a product. So I will call it payload post product, and I will be checking using the should bind JSON. So as we said, it will bind the payloads coming from our request into the payloads track over there, and we need to pass a payload, a pointer of the payload, and if there is an error, then we want to return, and we want to return a response, and in that case it will be a bad request, so a 400 status code, and we need to return the error as well. So passing the error like this is not very convenient, and personally I like to create a wrapped response of the response that is returned from the API. So in that case I want to create a HTTP response, which will be a struct, and this will have a status, and it will be an integer, and we also want to have a success, so this will be a boolean flag, and it will tell us if the request was successful. We want to pass a message, and that message is mainly whenever you have an error, and we also need to set to pass some data, and that data will be an interface, and that's it. So I will be creating a factory for creating that response. So it will be returned to me an HTTP struct, and we'll be passing as arguments the status. We'll be passing data, and this will be interface. So we'll be checking if the data is actually message, and if it's message, we'll be casting it into a string. And we can use a switch case and checking the status code, right? And if the status code is, we'll be putting as some of the status code. So if it's a bad request, if it's a status internal, an internal server error, if it's unauthorized, if it's forbidden, if it's a not found error, and if it's a timeout. So then in that case I want to return an HTTP response, and the response, we have the status that I pass over there, so we know that this won't be a valid response, and we want to pass a message. So in that case we will be passing data, and we'll be checking the data. So we assume that we either pass a string or an error, so we'll be casting the data into an error. So if it's an error and the casting is successful, then we want to, I'm gonna copy this one. So we know it's an error, so we can call it there. If not, then that means it's a string, and we will be returning a string there. We'll be actually casting it into a string. In any other case, we assume that the response is successful, and we're gonna return the status code that it has been passed as success, and the data that it has been passed. So we created a utility, so currently it lives into the controller, so I want to move it outside, and I will set it as HTTP response, right? And this one will live over there, and that one will be on the internal package. And I will try to import it. So I can create a response here. So and I will be passing the error. So the error will be returned and it will be a wrap response. So what we can do now is, so we know that we'll be getting the payload, and let's try to print the payload. So if we test our post request and go into body, pass something over there, so we expect to get an error now. So we see that we get a formatted response, which I really like. So you see that we get everything that we need, and the error is on the message. So we haven't passed anything and we get an error because of the missing name and the price, which is what we expect. So let's pass a name now up, so the name should be Apple. The price would be 0.09, and we're not passing any description at the moment, but we can pass if we want, and we see that we got the product over there. The next step is to insert that payload into the database, and what we can do is to make an exec. So, and we want to pass a context. So we will use the context available from the request. And we're passing the context, and in that case we need to set the query. So the query will be insert into products, and now we'll be inserting the name or GUID, name, price, description if there is a description, and create an ad. And we'll be setting values, and we're just gonna put some placeholders down here because we're gonna pass them as parameters, and just to avoid SQL injection. I won't get into more details into this one, and we see that we get a result and an error. So if result and an error and blah blah blah. So if it's not named, then okay, and I will be ignoring the result for the moment. And we need to create a GUID. So the GUID, as we said, we have installed the UUID library, and we'll be using this one to generate an ID. And we also need to set a create add date. So we'll be using the time package to create a date, and we want to format that date based on RFC 3339, and we need to pass those values as arguments. So the first one will be GUID. The second one needs to be the name, so that one is available from the payload. The third one is the price, so that's also available from the payload. The fourth one is the description, so that's from the payload, and the created ad. So if we get any error, so we want to return a response, and in that case will be an internal server error. And we want to set the response into the writer. Cool. So we managed to insert our product but we also need to get our product from the database and return it over here. So what we can do is to first create a model of a product, which includes all the properties or the schema of the product in our database. So in that case, I will get the products track, and I will be copying those 3 fields since they are similar. And I want to pass a GUID. So this will be a string. And I want also to set the created add field, which also is a string. And now we need to set the product, and that will be a product, and we can use the query row. And if we check more into the SQL module, so in the DB, we can see that query executes a query that is expected to return at most 1 row. And we see that we pass in query and a variety parameter of interfaces, and we get a row. So if we check what is a row, so the row is a struct and has 2 methods, so the arrow and the scan, and we'll be using scan to map the values from our query into the product struct. So in that case, we'll be using select GUID, name, price, description, and created add from products where GUID equals blah, and we'll be passing the GUID that we have created. So we know that we get a row, and what we'll be doing now is to scan that row. So, and we'll need to map those values into our model. So I'll be using pointer of GUID. So that should be price. And if there is any error, then if there is any error, I will also return a 500 error. So we pass in GUID. This is the first that we request: the name, the price, description, and the created add. Cool. And so since we have the product now, we can return it. So I will be updating our statement over there too. So I need to return a 201 code. So status created, and I need to create my response. So in that case, I will be setting new http response. So status created, and pass the product. And so I'm setting the response over there. And what else is, it's a common practice to set the location header when you create a new resources. And when you create a new resource, if you follow a convention, if you are following REST conventions, so let's try to do it. So in the writer, I want to set the header and add the location header. So that tells the location of the new resource. So in that case, it will be products, and I will be using an Esprit, and this one will be the GUID. So /products and GUID, and the ID, the GUID of the product, tells to the clients where that resource is available, so we can find it. And if we test our request now and try to post the data and set the description. We see that we get a 201 response, and the data is everything that we have passed into our endpoint, into our request. So we can also check the database. So if we search the products table, we see that we have the ID, we have the GUID, name, price, description, and the date of the creation. Nice. So now we can continue setting the logic related with the get products. So what we can do is we won't be passing any information in the get products endpoint. So in that case, the only thing that we need to do is to query the database, get all the products from the database, and return them to the user. So we won't be doing any pagination or filtering on our data, since it's a small exercise and it's unnecessary. So what we'll be doing is we'll be using the query, and we need to select the products from the table. So I will be getting GUID, name, price, description, and create an add from products. And as we see here, we get a pointer of rows and an error. And if we check the documentation, rows is also a struct, and it has a few methods to it. So one of them is close, so we will need to defer that method so that we make sure that we reallocate the resources that on the request. We also gonna use the next method, since it tells us whenever there is more information available which we can't get, and we will also be using the scan to map the information from the query into a particular construct. So we know that we get rows and we get an error, right? So I like to set my variables at the top, and set an equality here, so it will be assigned over there, but that's just a personal preference. And I will be if there is an error, this one will be internal server error. And we need to create our response. So the response is available from the internal module. So new HTTP response, and we are setting the error. So now what we need to do is to defer the closing of the rows, and if there are any rows available, then I want to set them to my product, and I need to create a slice of products. Right, so I will be scanning my row now. So if there is an error, then I want to return, and I want to set it here. So there is, so this should be enough. So we'll be returning a status 500 error if there is an error, and I want to map the information coming from the select query. So in that case, we're using we need description, and we also need create an ad. So after the scan was successful, then we want to append the new product into our list of products, and we can return a response. But before we return a response, we need to check the length of the product. So if there isn't any product within the slides, then we need to return a 404 error. And this one, cool. And what we can do now, we can return the 200 status codes, and we can create our response. So response and this, and we can pass the products, and we have our get products controller. So if we test the endpoint now, get products, we see that we get the list of the products, but we haven't tested the 404 functionality. So what we can do is to manually delete the entry that we have. And if we check the table, now it's empty. So what I expect now is to get a 404, and we get a 500, and that's because I'm setting an error, but I need to create an error. So in that case, I will be using the error f method from the format module. So, or I can use the SQL error no rows. So if we see here, so that's an already created error, and it just says no rows in result set. So if I call my endpoint, I see that I get my 404. Cool. So let's create another product since we tested our functionality. And if we get the products, if we check get products again, we get our 200 response. Now we can continue with the implementation of the get product. So what we expect now is for a user to pass a GUID, and we're gonna process that. We're gonna use that GUID to search our database. So we'll be using mode binding again, and the name of the structure that we create is GUID binding. So I'm expecting a GUID. This will be a string, right? And I will set the binding for a URI, so I will set GUID, and I also need to do some validation. So this is required, and we also need to pass a UUID. So this one we make sure that the string will be a UUID. So we can use it here now. So first I need to create my binding. And I will be using should bind URI, so it will extract all that information into the binding struct over there. And I'm just gonna use what we have written over there, since this one will return a 500 error. And nice, and we have access into the GUID now, and we can use the query row, and query row context. I tend to use the context because it just tells you the database to close if there is an error outside from the database. So and in that case it would be if there is an error in a different place of the controller, then it will automatically notify the database and also like return an error, and just to avoid continue the processing of query of fetch of selecting information. So in that case I will be using select and GUID name price description and created add, and I need from products, and we expect to get a GUID, and we're gonna use that GUID, so that will return as a row. And we need to scan, and we also need to create a product. So we'll be passing a pointer on the product fields. And this will return an error, and we can check the error. So I need to update this one because it's invalid since the value of the GUID is inside the bind extract. So if we check this one, returns an error. But before this one, I want to check the documentation, because this, if the scan fails, it also means that sometimes it may return a not found error, and we may need to capture this one. So yeah, scan returns error not rows if it doesn't find any entry, so we need to keep that one in mind. And if there is an error here, so if the error equals of error not rows, so in that case we want to return a 404 error. Right, and now we can return a 500 error for any other scenario. And if the code reached to that point, it means that the query was successful, and we can return a 200 source code. We set our response, we don't need to return anything. So if we scroll down, we see that the server is still running, and if we actually see our products, we see that we have that GUID, so we can copy this one, right? And if we go into get products, we can use that GUID, so get products, so we get a 200 response, but if we change it to something different, we get the 404, so it captured that, we captured that error over there, and it seems to be working okay for me. Now let's see the implementation of the delete product, since it will be easier compared to the product. So the code is very similar with what we have over here, to be honest. So I'm gonna copy the code, and I'm just gonna use delete product. So we don't need the quit binding since it already exists in the get product, and we still have access from it. So let's review what we have over there. So we are looking into we extract the GUID, and now what we need to do is delete from products where GUID is equal in the value that we passed to it, and we need to update this just to an exit contact. So we get the result in an error. So I will set the result and the error as variables, and here so if there is an error, I want to return something, and so it's not a pointer of a result, it's actually a result. In that case, it will be an internal server error. So now we can delete that code, and we can check if a result has been captured actually, because if we see here, we have access into the last insert ID and the rows affected, so we can check the number of rows that they have been deleted, and if the value is 0, then it means that none of the rows has been affected, and we can return a 404. So, and products, and if end products equal 0, then return a 404. And we often don't need the deleted product, so in that case I won't be returning a product into the client, rather than I will return a 204 error, which refers to no content. And I'm not passing anything. So if we get a 204, it means that the deletion was successful. So let's test our code now. So if we get the products, we see we can get the GUID over here. We can test the delete controller. So if it's an ID that it's not valid, we get a 500 error, and that's because the GUID that we have is actually not valid. So it seems that the validation rule from Gene that we said it's correct. So if I paste the actual GUID and update the last value, so we get a 500 error, and the reason is again the same thing that we did before. So I will set it to error not rows, so we don't have a variable of errors, so I haven't created it. So but it seems that it actually catched the 404 over there. So now we get a valid response, and if I try to delete the product, we get a 204, and if we check the database, we see that we don't get anything. Nice. Let's create one more product, since we're gonna need it to update it, and let's move into the put implementation. The put product controller will be the most difficult one, since it requires a few things from our side. So one of them, it will be to extract the GUID coming from the request URL, and another requirement is to extract the payload coming from the request. So let's start with those two. So I will be setting the binding variable, and it will be using the GUID binding model that we created previously. Next, I need to set the variable with the name payload, and the type of it would be put product, and we need to create that struct now. So the put product struct will include the name properties, and this will be required only if the description and the price field, they are not available. So without and set the name of price and description. The next one is price, so this will be a float, and there is not anything that we want to validate in the price, except that we want it to be greater than 0. And the last thing is description, which is string, and we don't want to validate anything about it, or we can include the validation, which is the maximum number of characters. So if I remember correctly, post product includes something similar, so just gonna copy the same validation rule. So we managed to set the type for the payload, and let's try to extract them from our request. So in that case, and I'm passing the pointer of the binding. If there is any error, then I want to return it. So in that case, the status code will be 400, and we will be passing the error for the message. We want to return, and also to set the status code and return the response that we created. We need to do the same operation for extracting the payload. So in that case, I'll be using payload, and rather than should bind URI, I will use should bind JSON. So we assume that the data will be coming as the JSON data, and if there is an error, we return that error. Nice. Then next thing that we need to do is to find the existing record of the product. So we want to check if the product of the GUID of the product that we are passing is available. So in that case, I will be using maybe cure context. So I need to set the context. And I need to set my SQL. So I want to get name, price, and description. And from products, GUID is blah, and I need to set the placeholder for the GUID. So in this case, it will be GUID. So now I need to set a variable of the current product, and this will be on the product, and I want to scan my row. So the first parameter will be the name, and second one will be the price, and the third one will be the description. So if there is an error, we want to catch that error, and we need to check the error because previously we discussed that row scan may return a 404 error, so we want to catch that error. So if error equal error not rows, so in that case we want to return a 404 error, and we will update our response variable to be status not found error. And now we need to set the error here to an internal server error. Nice. So we managed to get the value of the current product, so let's try to log it. So if we check our products, so we'll go into my clients, get products, find. So I will be creating a product. So generate this product. If I get my product, I see that I get Apple. So I will copy this one, and if I call my put endpoint, I get an internet server error, and The reason is the valid value for it empty, so I had a typo over there. So if I call it again, we see that we get a 200, and the current product, we get all the values of the current product. Nice. So the next thing that we want to do is to update our product, and we need to create the right SQL for doing this one. So that one will be exit context. So we're passing the context and want to update product, set name equals description equal, and we set a placeholder for them where grid equal, and we set the value of them. So since there are 3 options available there, so we may be passing the name, but price and description will be empty, so we need to map that information into our product, onto our current product. So current product will have the updated values, so we'll be using a library to copy information from one structure into another, and the library that I will be using is copier. So if I'm doing copier into the view, so here is copier. So let's have a quick look into their description. So copier, it copies everything from one to another, and in the example here we have 2 structs. So one is employee and the other struct is user, and we see that both of the structs, they share similar fields, and in the example below it creates a user with those values and also an employee with those values, and copies information from the user into the employee. So we're passing pointers of the structs, and when we print the output of the employee, we see that it got the values coming from the user. So for example, Jizu it's available now into the employee as well. So we'll be using this library, and one thing that we also need is to set some options for us, since we're gonna have like some empty values and we want to ignore them. So we need to configure copier so that they ignore empty flag it's true, and also we want deep copy. So if there is a deep if there is a struct with multiple levels of deep, so we want to use those as well. And I need to install it now, so I'll be using go get. So now I can import it, and I will be setting a few options. So option, so in that case we'll be setting ignore empty, and ignore empty true, and deep copy to true. And we want to use copier now to copy with options. So here we need to set the 2 values. So in our case it will be the current product, and here will be the payload, and I will be passing down the options. So the values available from the payload will be moved into the current product, and we can use the current product to populate the placeholders here. So if there is an error, then return that error, and we will be returning a 500 error in that case. So just to make sure we get an error, we're passing the 2 value from value. And let's have a look into the updated value of the current product. So if I call my endpoint, so I pass pineapple and price 1.2. So we see here that previously, so the product, the name of the product is apple and the price is 0.9, and now when we log the value, we see that we have pineapple and 1.2. So the mapping between the 2 structs has been done correctly, and the exit conduct returns a result and an error. So I won't be using the result, so I will ignore it, and I'm only interested for the error. So if there is an error, I want to return a 500 error. And I need to set the placeholders here. So the first one will be the name. Description and GUID, or actually binding GUID. So we managed to make the update of our product, and what we need to do now is to get the new record from the database of the product. So I will be using the same select query that we used previously, and in that case it will be updated row, and I will call it product. And in my scan I want to use a product, so I use product. We don't need to check if there is a 404 error, since we are checking it here, and definitely when if our execution goes below that point, it means that the product is available. And for rather than row, I need to use updated row. So I need to include a few other options here as well. So GUID, name, price, description, and create a path, and I need to include those in my scan. So we have the updated product, and we can return it to the users. And we need to set the response variable. And we want to return the product. And let's test our code now. So we get products, we see what is available over there. I'm copying the GUID, so before that I want to pass an empty. I need to test the validation, so I'm passing an empty. So in that case, the required without all rule that we said, it's working okay. So if we pass a price, which is negative, we see that the greater than tag has been worked correctly. And let's actually test the 404 and the 404 error. And in that case, I'll be using some values. And let me see again what's the product in the database. So this one, and if we go in the post, I'm pasting this one, but I will update the last value. And price up. Did I probably updated the wrong value previously? So, and the name should be pineapple. So when we see that we get the 404 error. And now if I set this into the correct one, we have a syntax error, and I need to find out where is the error, and that's on the description. We missed the equal sign. And if we call our endpoint again, we see that we got the updated values here, and our update has worked correctly. And so let's review all our endpoints. So we get products, we have this one. So if we want to get a single product, we can use the get product. So in that case, we can use the GUID. So I will be using the old GUID that we tested in the previous endpoint. So we get a 404. In reality, that field is not that GUID is not available. So if we use the right one, we get a 200 response. Now let's try to delete something. So we delete if we use an invalid GUID. we see that we get the 404. If we use a valid one, we get a 200. If we check the products, we see that we get a 404 because non-product is available. Let's create something. So we'll be using that payload. And the new GUID is this one. And we see that the new record has been created. And if we try to update the product, so if we go here, so I want to name it Apple, and I just won't be pricing anything else. So the name has been updated and the price stayed the same, as well as the description. And we see that with those 5 endpoints, we're able to do any CRUD operations that we want in our resource, and we successfully managed to create a simple API that delivers what we wanted from the beginning. This was the end of this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you on the next one. Thank you.